Despite the negative 10-degree temperatures outside, I decided to go for a walk. The cold was not inviting, but something in me needed air, movement, and a moment away from the closed loops of thought that accumulate when we stay inside ourselves for too long. Before leaving, I brewed a mug of homemade cocoa, thick, sweet, and still steaming. I carried it with me as a small act of comfort against the hostility of winter. The world outside was sharp and clean. Snow muted the usual sounds. My breath moved in invisible clouds. I walked to the circle clearing, the place where I go to meditate and discharge negative energy, and I let the cold strip away whatever tension I had been carrying. I stayed only about a half of an hour. Eventually, the fire inside my house began to call more loudly than the stillness outside, and I turned back, already feeling the warmth before I had reached the door. When I stepped into the mudroom and began removing my coat and gloves, my wife saw me and immediately began dry heaving, making gagging sounds and reacting as if something deeply unpleasant had entered the house with me. "What is wrong?" I asked, genuinely confused. "There's snot and spit in your beard," she said, clearly convinced of what she was seeing. I looked down, touched my beard, and understood instantly. The cocoa that I had been drinking outside had frozen into pale streaks along the hair of my beard. I said calmly, "It's cocoa that froze in my beard." But she continued reacting as if it were snot. Our son came out to see what the commotion was about. My wife explained her version of the scene. I said, "Your mom is lying to herself about what she saw and is convincing herself that something happened that did not." That only made things worse. She became upset and told me to leave her alone. The moment itself was trivial. It would have been easy to laugh it off, to wipe my beard and move on. But something about it lingered in my mind, not because of the misunderstanding, but because of how stubbornly belief had replaced observation. What struck me was not that she was mistaken. What struck me was that once the mistake had taken root, the truth no longer mattered. No matter what the truth was, even if I could prove it, she wanted no part of my truth. She was offended when I explained it plainly in simple, unpolished language to another person. The facts were no longer relevant. What mattered was what she believed she had seen. In that moment, I realized how often this happens, not only in households, but everywhere. Personal beliefs are not passive things. They shape perception. They filter reality. They decide in advance what we are willing to accept as true and what we must reject, even when the evidence stands plainly before us. This small domestic scene became a quiet lesson in epistemology, in how we know what we think we know. Somehow, without noticing, our feelings or our emotions take the front seat and begin driving. Fear, disgust, pride, embarrassment, they seize the wheel and steer us away from clarity and straight into resistance. Once emotion is in control, perception bends, observation becomes interpretation, interpretation hardens into belief, and belief, once formed, defends itself. Facts, by contrast, are remarkably simple. There either was cocoa in my beard or there was not. Yet simplicity does not guarantee acceptance. How often do we exist only inside our own versions of things? How often do we connect not to what is happening, but to what we believe is happening? How often do we reject reality not because it is unclear, but because it threatens the story we are already telling ourselves? We say we want truth, but often what we really want is comfort. People react to whatever they see or hear. This is how most of us move through the world now, quickly, reflexively, emotionally. We respond before we reflect. We defend before we investigate. And once we are convinced we are right, we rarely pause to ask whether being right is actually the point. Perhaps the better practice is quieter, to give others only positivity and kindness to react to feel no pride in being right while everyone else is wrong, to remember that certainty is not the same thing as understanding. Being right does not need to announce itself. It does not need to perform. It does not need to persuade. In the end, arguments rarely change minds. Explanations rarely dissolve beliefs. What moves people is not logic alone, but presence, energy, tone. The way we occupy a room, the way we hold ourselves when we speak, the way we choose patience over victory. Words are fragile tools. Energy, on the other hand, is difficult to ignore. And in the quiet spaces between misunderstanding and understanding, it is almost always our energy, not our words, that tells the truer story.